Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. Happy Wednesday. And can you believe it? It's almost April already, at least depending on what part of the world you are connecting from. Happy Wednesday. Thanks for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Hold on one second. Okay, welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. This is day 3 of our Van Gogh Film Festival. And tonight we're going to be discussing and then later live streaming Loving Vincent, the Vincent Van Gogh film that came out in 2017. Before we dive into the film, we always welcome people to introduce themselves. So in the Zoom chat or the Q&A, or in the comments section on Facebook, you can tell us your first name, where you're connecting from, and if you have a favorite art-related film. It's always fascinating to find out where people are joining us from, and then also interesting to learn about people's interests and preferences and things like that. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. And then if you're watching on Zoom, we don't have time to do a Zoom demonstration, unfortunately, if you're not familiar with the application, but it's pretty straightforward. Usually there's just a couple things that people want to know how to do. One is adjust the sound. Everyone will be in listen only mode, except for myself, or muted. So if you start cheering or singing during the film, don't worry. No one outside of your household will be able to hear you. If you do want to raise or lower the volume on your session, you can check the settings locally on your device. We had a sound test earlier. Everything seems to be working fine. If you want to adjust the screen display, this is something that people sometimes want to know how to do. If you see a box that has my name on it, Robert Kelleman, and you want to make that go away so that the slides and the videos that we're showing take up the full screen, look for something on your device called either View or View Options. It's usually at the top of your session, and you can click off the side-by-side mode. Throughout our program, if you have any questions or comments, again, you can type those in the Zoom chat or the Q&A or the comment section on Facebook. One of my favorite parts about doing these programs is just hearing the different opinions and perspectives of people that are participating in the programs, like all of you. So greatly appreciate that. And we'll go ahead and get started in just 1 second. Okay, so for those of you not familiar with us, we're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. And back a long time ago before COVID, we used to do all of these in-person programs throughout the Washington, D.C. area. And one of our most popular programs was we used to do a Van Gogh and Impressionism tour at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Of course, that's on hold because of COVID, but we'll start that back up at some point in time once it's safe to do so. And then another thing that we sometimes do is attend film screenings. And so when Loving Vincent came out in October of 2017, our group went and checked it out. I forget how many of us there were, but it was a pretty good sized group. We went down and had dinner beforehand, watched the movie, and then talked about it afterwards. And so because we can't do anything like that, we've had these live stream programs. So thanks for joining us. For those of you I haven't met before, my name is Robert Kelleman. I'm the founder and the director of the Washington, D.C. History and Culture Organization, and we're currently celebrating our 6th-year anniversary. So thank you all for participating in our programs. And the reason why we're meeting here this week is because yesterday was Vincent Van Gogh's 168th birthday, if you can imagine that. It's born on March 30th, 1853. So if you haven't already done so, make sure you have a piece of cake for Vincent so that he knows how much you appreciate him, since he wasn't fully appreciated during his lifetime. And Vincent died at the age of 37 on July 29th, 1890. And so we've been having all of these Van Gogh film programs this week. We watched Lust for Life with Kirk Douglas on Monday. On Tuesday, yesterday, we watched At Eternity's Gate, and today we're going to be discussing and talking about Loving Vincent. So thanks for joining us. And if you wanted to watch the Well, let me back up a minute. So what we're going to do tonight, if you haven't been on one of these programs, is I'm going to talk for a little while about the film, maybe like, I don't know, 45 minutes or so, give or take a few minutes, and talk about the film. Was it accurate? Things to look for, how was it developed? Stuff like that. And then after that's over with, we'll actually stream the whole entire film. If you're watching on Zoom, if you're watching on Facebook, we can't stream the film on there because of copyright issues. So that's the story with that. And if you wanted to watch any of the previous film program introductions that we had, like the historical context part for the Lust for Life or At Eternity's Gate, or even this one, they'll eventually be on our YouTube page later this week. The name of our organization again is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We have several other programs on there. We have a couple about Monet. We have some on Renoir. So you can go check that out. And we're already starting to plan ahead what our next film history program is going to be. And we're thinking it's going to be Frida. Now, we don't have the exact date for this just yet, but it'll probably get that figured out in the next few days. And as soon as we do, I'll be happy to email that information to all of you, and you guys can come check it out with us. So the purpose of these programs is kind of fourfold. Number one, we want to view great films, including ones we either haven't seen before or haven't seen in a long time, so we don't do any current releases. We want to study history and popular culture through films. Number three, we want to learn the historical context of the film, its creators, and the subjects portrayed, in this case, Vincent Van Gogh. And number four, we want to discover additional historical resources like films, music, books, museums, etc., that might be of interest on the particular topic we're speaking on. And today we're talking about Loving Vincent. And so it's a fascinating film, and be curious to see what your opinion of it is. This is my personal opinion, and you're welcome to agree or disagree with me or somewhere in between. So I like this film overall, which is one reason why we're showing it. The parts of it I liked, I thought very visually stunning. You'll see what I mean if you have not viewed any of it before in just a little bit. I like the unique animated format of the story, how they put that together. And just the overall storyline was interesting. And the third thing I liked was my kind of critique for these historical type films is, do they capture the essence of the person that's being described or the event or the subject? And I feel like this film does. It does kind of capture the essence of Vincent's life and his art when you get done watching that. A couple of the concerns I had with, like the other two films that we streamed earlier this week, I think there's just still too much emphasis on the whole mental health side of thing. Obviously, mental health, very important issue for all of us, played a very important part of Vincent's life, but I feel like the film had too much kind of focus on that, in my opinion. I also was concerned with, it has a lot of artistic liberties. There was quite a few fictional aspects of the film that were included. As you're watching it, you have to be careful because some of the stuff that they discuss is actually 100% historical accurate, and some of it, for lack of a better word, is just made up. And so if you're a historical purist, you might have some concerns with that. I'm not, which is why I recommend watching the film, but some people tend to get kind of hung up on some of the aspects of the film. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But overall, I do recommend the film, which is why we're streaming it. And so let's go from there. So again, these were the three films we were showing this week. We had Lust for Life on Monday, At Eternity's Gate on Tuesday, and then today, Loving Vincent. And if you wouldn't mind, if you're a speaker, it's always helpful if you know a little bit about the group that you're speaking to. And since we can't meet face to face, I would love to ask you a poll question and see how many of these other films you've seen with us. So I'm going to ask you a poll question, and how many of these films have you seen, not just on your own, but just with us this week? And so you can answer that you've seen the two previous ones with us, one or the other, or neither. Any of the answers is fine. It'll just help me with my presentation, knowing how many of you were here when we saw the other films before. So I'll leave this up for a few seconds, let all of you respond, and then I'll be happy to share the results with you. And then we'll get started after that. I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, let me go ahead and share the results. Wow, this is really flattering. So a lot of you were here for the previous film programs. That's really awesome. So wow, 53% actually saw both of them with us. That's cool. Let's see, 25% saw one or the other, and 25% haven't seen any. If you haven't seen any, that's totally fine. You might be wondering why it adds up to more than 100%. I think that's because of rounding, so won't worry about that. But that's really flattering, so thank you. I appreciate your response on that. I'm going to close the results for that, so that should go away. If for some reason it doesn't, you can either exit out or minimize it or drag it down to the bottom of your screen or whatnot. So let's go ahead and get started. One of the things that was interesting about these films was they all, to a certain degree, took advantage of self-portraits that Vincent made. And so what do I mean by that? Well, Vincent, during his lifetime, made 36 self-portraits. I put this matrix together so you can see all of them at one time. If you're familiar with Vincent, you might recognize some of these. He made the one in the top left first, and then in sequential order made all the subsequent ones from the top row, second row, third row, and fourth row, concluding in the one in the bottom right corner. And in particular, there are the three films all took advantage or used one of the self-portraits prominently in the film. And so what do I mean by that? Well, Lust for Life, they used the Vincent Van Gogh self-portrait that's at my former employer, the Detroit Institute of Arts. So the film kind of design or look was centered around that. At Eternity's Gate used the two self-portraits that Vincent made after he had his ear incident. And you can see the William Dafoe character there. And what about Loving Vincent? It takes use of the Van Gogh self-portrait that's at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. That's the portrait on the right, and then the Loving Vincent material on the left. So you can see a pretty good resemblance there. Now, what this image is showing you, these three images, that's Vincent's portrait on the left. And then in the center is the actor that portrayed Vincent. And then on the far right, where they merged the two images together. So they didn't use the exact artwork. They used images of the artwork though, and they also kind of green screened the actors while they were doing their parts, and then merged the two together to get kind of the finished product on the right. So that's what that is. Interestingly enough, they don't have a lot of information on Vincent's early life, but they do have a quick snippet talking about his childhood, which I liked. It talks about the fact that he was the oldest child, but he wasn't the first child. So his parents actually had a son that was also going to be named Vincent, that was stillborn a year before Vincent himself was born. And the film talks about how maybe that might have had some kind of impact on his life later on. So I thought that was interesting. Let's talk about Vincent Van Gogh in France. Vincent, born and raised in the Netherlands. However, he spends the last 4.5 years of his life in France. The reason why most films, books, magazine articles, et cetera, museum exhibits focused on Vincent's later life, the time he spent in France, is because that's when he makes most of his well-known or iconic paintings. These are all examples of Vincent's works that he made while he was living in France. And just a real quick geography lesson. So the 4.5 years that Vincent spends in France, he starts out in Paris, then he moves down to the south of France. And in the film, the first few scenes are related to the town of Arles, A-R-L-E-S, which is in the south of France. That's where Vincent was living after he left Paris. But then he moves up to the northern France region in a town called Auvers, and that's where he lives for the final 10 weeks of his life. And that's where most of the film is set. So I just wanted to make sure, if you're not familiar with the geography of France, where these places are. So again, most of the film is in Auvers, but there's a little bit that's in the beginning of the film in Arles, and then a little bit in Paris, just so you know where those places are at in France. The film references and has Vincent's brother Theo. This was Vincent's younger brother, who was 3 years younger than Vincent. He was an art dealer in Paris. He managed an art gallery, basically selling the work of other individuals. And he's very supportive of Vincent throughout his lifetime. He provides emotional and financial assistance to Vincent, and allows Vincent, to spend the last several years of his life focusing on making artwork full time. So he did not have any other jobs the last several years of his life. He was a full-time artist, even though he only sold one painting. And Vincent and Theo spend a lot of time writing letters back and forth with one another. If you want to learn more about Vincent, get more of kind of a deeper insight into him and his life, I really recommend getting one of these Van Gogh letters books. The image on the right is not from the book. It's that's actually one of the letters, but it has the text in English or different languages, and you can actually read the letters that Vincent Van Gogh wrote. So very fascinating. And the reason I bring up the letters is because that's part of the storyline. So the concept of the film is there's this letter that was misplaced, and now it has to be delivered to Vincent's family. This is taking place after Vincent dies. So that's kind of appropriate because Vincent did write a lot of letters during his lifetime. And the film is conceived around these different characters that Vincent knew. And to a large degree, it's based on artwork that Vincent made of these different individuals. Some of the characters are fictitious, but quite a few of them are actually real people that Vincent knew. So let's do this. We'll go through and talk about some of the film, kind of overall things to look for. This film, if you're not familiar with it, it's a animated film, and what they did is they took over 100 Van Gogh paintings and built a story around it. And then the beginning of the film, it says, this film you're about to see has been entirely hand painted. So every frame of the film was a hand painting depiction of something, typically Van Gogh related type stuff, by a team of over 100 artists. So a lot of people went into putting this together. And if you're familiar with some of Vincent's paintings, you'll see references to them in the film. So like, for instance, this is his famous Starry Night painting. It's incorporated in the beginning of the film. This is his famous Night Cafe painting. That's also early on in the film, you'll see it. This is the inside of the Night Cafe. You'll see that early on as well. And then they even have when he had his ear incident. So again, it's a kind of a visual smorgasbord of different types of things to look at. There's all these different characters in the film. So I thought what I would do is go through and talk about who these people were, if there's artwork related to Vincent Van Gogh, and then also too, some of these characters are pretty much spot on the way they were in real life, and then some of them are completely fictitious. So I thought I'd go through and talk about which one is which. So the first two people are Joseph and Armand Rouen. And Mr. Rouen was the postman. You might have seen him before if you've seen any of Vincent's paintings. He famously did portraits of the postman. And how you look at this slide is that's the actor that played the postman in the film. The Van Gogh original painting is in the center. And then when they mix the two together or merge the two together, they come up with the film image on the far right. So again, actor, original painting, and then film image. Here's another depiction of the postman. And interestingly enough, Vincent painted this gentleman 6 different times. He was very close to this guy. This was down in the south of France in the town of Arles. When Vincent moves there, he doesn't know anyone that's living here. He has no friends here, no family here. And he, for quite a while, had a very lonely existence for a long extended or a high percentage of the time he's there. However, he does become good friends with this gentleman. They were kind of like drinking buddies, so to speak. And there's actually 6 different portraits that Vincent made of him hanging at 6 different museums. So in the top row, you have Boston, then Detroit, my former employer, the Detroit Institute of Arts, Switzerland, and then on the bottom row, Netherlands, Philadelphia at the Barnes Collection, and then New York. Here are the 6 portraits individually. So you can tell this is someone who's very important to Vincent's life because he ends up painting him so many times. It's kind of unusual for him to paint the same person over and over again, unless that person was very close to him, which this gentleman was. And again, he's the local postman. The portraits are interesting because they're all similar, but yet they're all a little bit different as well. Each one is unique, even though they're the same subject and done by the same artist. I'll go back to the beginning just so you can see them all six again. So again, very interesting. They're all similar, but yet they're all different. Okay, so there's that. And Vincent talked frequently in his letters about his friend, the postman. This was a letter he wrote to his brother Theo, just to give you kind of a sense of Vincent's thoughts on the postman. He says, quote, I am now working on a portrait of the postman with his dark blue and yellow uniform, a head like that of Socrates. His wife had a baby today, so he feels on top of the world and glows with satisfaction. So that's Vincent talking about his friend, the postman. And he also did several portraits of the postman's wife. So here are those images. And these are portraits of the baby that he was referring to in the previous letter. So you can see he did numerous portraits of this family. It shows you how close he was to these people. So when they go through that in the film and you see that connection that he has with this family, that's not a made up thing. That's actually true. And just to kind of show you what kind of person the friend was, the postman was as a friend to Vincent, this is a letter that the postman wrote to Vincent. It kind of gives you a sense of what kind of guy he was, how friendly he was, and how supportive he was of Vincent. He says, quote, Sir and dear friend Vincent, I received your letter with great pleasure, especially to learn that you are in good health. He actually wrote Vincent this letter when Vincent was in a mental hospital suffering from different ailments. He says, continue to take good care of yourself. Follow the advice of your good doctor, and you will see your complete recovery to the satisfaction of your relatives and your friends. And then he kind of talks about some other stuff. And then he says, do not be discouraged. Work in those beautiful fields. Take advantage of the models that nature provides you. With work, health will return. Dear Mr. Vincent, accept my sincere regards as well as those of my wife and my children. Marcel, that's his wife, sends you a big kiss. I shake both your hands, your entirely devoted Ruan. So again, it gives you kind of a sense of the relationship that the two guys have. And so you'll see that in the film when you see the postman and you see that he has this really deep concern over Vincent. That's not a made up thing. They actually were very close in lifetime. In fact, it's fair to say that maybe he was his closest friend down in the south of France. Here is a picture of the postman a little bit later in life. This photo on the right is about 15 years after Vincent's portrait. So he's much older at that point in time. And here he is in the film. So you can be on the lookout for his character, very unique and distinguished looking with the beard and the postal uniform. And then here's kind of an image of how they would make the film. So the characters, the actors and actresses are typically in front of a green screen, and then they would add the artistic background behind it. And in the film, this is his son. So he's pretty much the main character, the son, the gentleman in the yellow jacket or the gold jacket on the right, pretty much like the main character of the film. That's him with his dad, the postman. And in real life, Vincent painted these children as well. So the postman and his wife have three kids. They have the baby daughter, and then they had two sons, the younger son on the bottom, and then the older son on the top. And again, Vincent ends up painting this. He makes over 20 portraits of this family. And what's funny is quite a few of the portraits he actually gave to them when he was done with them, and they had him hanging in their house, all these different portraits that Vincent had gave him. So if you could have traveled back in time, or if you could actually seen their house, the inside of it would have looked like a modern art gallery filled with all these Van Gogh paintings. That must have been pretty amazing thing to see. Unfortunately, there's no pictures of that. But the character on the top row, the postman's oldest son, plays a key role in the film. And here's the Vincent painting on the left and the film depiction on the right. And then again, this is the merging of the three. So you have the actor playing the son on the far left, the Van Gogh painting, the original, in the center. And then when they merge the two forms together, they get the film image on the right. And they do that through the green screen technology. Here it is depicted in the film. And so basically the storyline centers around the fact that this letter that Vincent wrote to his brother Theo is discovered, and the postman mails it to Theo, but it's returned. The postman down in Arles mails it to Vincent's brother Theo, because it's from Vincent, even though that Vincent's already passed away, but it's returned. And so he sends his son up to Paris to find out why the letter was returned and basically make sure it's hand delivered to Theo. There's another gentleman that's featured pretty prominently in the film, Mr. Tange, and this is him. And now who is he? Well, he's an actual real person that Vincent was friends with as well. Vincent and him got along very well. He owned a shop in Paris, not too far, just a few blocks from where Vincent lived. And that's where Vincent actually bought a lot of his art supplies, the paint and other items that he would use. And so he ends up doing portraits of this gentleman, which is interesting because the portraits kind of show Vincent's progression in style while he's living in Paris. So the painting on the far left, these are all the same guy, painted by Vincent Van Gogh during about a year and a half span. So the first painting on the far left, Vincent had just arrived in Paris from the Netherlands. And so his painting kind of colors are very traditional. It's kind of earth tones and nothing too elaborate. In the center painting, you can kind of see the impact the impressionists that he was meeting was starting to have on him, because there's a lot more color in that one. And then the third one on the far right, he spent the most time on putting it together. And then you can see that looks very impressionistic in terms of the colors. And then also too, interestingly enough, he's got all these Japanese prints in the background. Van Gogh is very influenced by Japanese artwork. In fact, Vincent actually painted a recreation of the image that's on the far right corner. So again, really interesting. Even if he wasn't friends with this guy, this would be an interesting set of paintings just because it does show Vincent's progression as an artist in a very short time frame, just a year and a half while he's living in Paris. But this gentleman's also very close to Vincent, very good friend of his, and he's also friends with many other impressionists. So here's the first portrait. Here is the second one. And the third one. And the third one's probably the most famous and well-known one. And so again, you'll see this gentleman in the film, and he's not a fictitious character. He's actually someone that knew Vincent. He owned a art supply store. And here's all three portraits side by side. And the store, the building that the store was in, still stands today. You can go visit it. It's now like a art, like a gallery type of space. And you can see the historical marker over on the left talks about the different people that bought paints from this guy. So Cezanne, Gauguin, Renoir, Lautrec, and then Van Gogh. So a lot of artists frequented his shop. So he's an important figure kind of behind the scenes in the history of Impressionism. And then here he is in the film. He's the one that breaks the news to the postman's son that Theo has died. So that's why the letter was returned, because Theo has died, and his wife, Theo's wife, moved back to the Netherlands, where she was originally from. And so again, that's a real character. Let's talk about some miscellaneous people you'll see in the film. We're a Washington, D.C. based organization, so I always like to promote the art of D.C. And this is one of the most famous Van Gogh paintings that's in Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery of Art. And they've included her in the film. It's kind of a very brief scene, but you can, if you've seen this painting in the National Gallery in DC, you can be on the lookout for that. Very distinctive clothing that she's wearing. The only difference is in the Van Gogh painting, she's not smoking a cigarette. And then this is another famous Van Gogh painting that's in DC. This is Girl in White. And she's also in the film, so you can be on the lookout for her. This one kind of disappointed me on a personal level because I really, really like the painting on the left. And in the film, the character that's played by this person she's not the friendliest person. I'll leave it at that. And here she is in the film again. So if you haven't seen the film before, you're getting kind of an idea. It's basically an animated film centered around these Van Gogh paintings. Here's another famous Van Gogh portrait on the left, the film character on the right. And then here's another one. Now, Vincent is known as being kind of a shy, introvert, which is to a certain degree true, but he did really like people. He was fascinated by people. And you can tell that just because of the fence that he makes so many portraits of people. So if he was totally a loner and didn't like people, he wouldn't have spent so much time making portraits of all these different people. So this does give you some insight into him. Your perception might be a little bit different than the reality. This is a famous painting that you might recognize from yesterday if you were with us. This one on the left was an old man that Vincent painted called At Eternity's Gate. And in the film, they have this painting be a doctor. So this is kind of one of the ones that's like a little bit stretch of the truth. So the person that Vincent painted was actually someone that he knew back in the Netherlands, and he was not a doctor. He was a retired individual. In the film, though, they have this character portraying a doctor. So again, it's a little bit of a historical inaccuracy, but all good. Just want to point that out. Then two key characters in the film are Dr. Gachet and his wife Marguerite. And again, same thing. There's the actor on the left. There's the Van Gogh painting in the center. And then the merging in the film on the right. Now, if you were with us yesterday, you're going to know the answer to this question. But if you weren't, what was the record price paid for a Van Gogh painting? What do you think? What's the most that anyone's ever spent to buy a Vincent Van Gogh painting? What do you think? Was it $1 million or $50 billion or something in the middle? Well, the answer is, and I'll give you a hint, the purchase that has the record price is actually the painting on the left. And the record price is $82.5 million that a businessman in Japan paid for that painting. It's of Dr. Gachet. And he was Vincent's doctor the last 10 weeks of his life when he's living in northern France. There's another version of this painting at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. That's it on the right. So the one that was bought at auction, the record price one, is on the left. The one that's at the museum in Paris is on the right. And again, that's Vincent's doctor. This is the picture of the doctor in real life. So this is a real person when you see this character in the film. This is not a made-up person. And here he is. He was treating Vincent the last 10 weeks of his life, and then he was also attending to him after he was shot. Now, this is the character that's most furthest from the truth. So this is the doctor's daughter, Dr. Gachet's daughter, Marguerite, and the Van Gogh painting of her is in the center. The actress that played her is on the left, and then the merging of the two is on the right. Now, in the film, they hint that there's a romantic story between Vincent and this young lady, which by every account I've ever seen is not actually true. So they took some artistic liberties with that part of the story. If you're the kind of person that's like a historical purist and you get really agitated and upset if a film deviates from the truth, you're probably going to struggle with loving Vincent because it does take quite a few artistic liberties. It's still a great film, still worthwhile to watch. You can still learn a lot about Vincent, but if you're going to get hung up on that, I can tell you right now, that's going to be a problem because this relationship that they kind of hint at that Vincent supposedly had with this young lady is just strictly Hollywood type stuff for the film. Didn't actually take place. So just keep that in mind. There's the Vincent painting on the left and then the image of her from the film on the right. Here's another painting that Vincent made of her. And then here she is in the film. So when you see this character, this is a real person, the doctor's daughter, but the extent of the role she played in Vincent's life is very different. She knew Vincent, she posed for him for a couple of times, she spoke with him practically, but they hint that there's like a romantic relationship between the two of these. And I don't know of any source that says that that actually took place. This clip from the film is really interesting because this image actually looks really like a Van Gogh painting, even though it's not. So this particular slide in the film is not a Van Gogh painting, but it looks like it could be just because the painting style, you can see the brush strokes and then how thick the paint is. So whoever the artist was that painted this one for the film really did a good job, because they made it look, in my opinion, exactly like a Van Gogh painting, even though it's not. There is no Van Gogh paint. It looks just like this one. And that's one of the challenges, kind of separating in the film which parts are the Van Gogh painting parts and which part are like the extrapolation, so to speak, like this one, but still interesting nonetheless. These are the scenes where they're hinting the romance between the two. Now let's talk about this young lady, Adeline Ravoux, and her family owned the inn where Vincent was living at the last 10 weeks of his life. He was renting a room in a boarding house that this young lady and her parents owned. This is her in the film. She's probably the second leading performer in terms of screen time after the Postman's son. And again, here's her in the green screen on the left, the Van Gogh painting of her in the center, and then the film version on the right. So if you're not familiar with the green screen, what that means is you basically have a actor or actress taped in front of a screen where the green background, and then you can put over the top of it whatever background you like. So that's what the story is behind that. That's kind of like an oversimplified version, but I think you get the point. This is the image of her family's establishment in the film. And here's a picture of it in real life. Now, this photo was taken many, many years after Vincent stayed there, but it will give you kind of a sense of what it looked like, historically speaking. That's the family out front. And then here's what it looks like today. So if you weren't on one of our previous programs, this is known as the house where Vincent Van Gogh died at, or the room where Vincent Van Gogh died. And you can actually visit this site in Anvers. Anvers is maybe like a 45-minute drive from Paris, northwest of downtown Paris, if the traffic is cooperating. Or you can take the train. It makes a great day trip, and you can actually see this site. So when Vincent was alive, it was a restaurant on the first level, just like it is now. And then the family was living in the middle level. The proprietors of this establishment were living in the middle level. And then the top floor was some rooms that they were renting out as like a boarding house. And that's where Vincent is living, up there. And again, here's the depiction in the film. Here's another shot from the film. And then this is what it looks like in more recent times. So you can actually go eat a meal here. So if you're visiting this town or city, I always like to say, nothing against McDonald's or Starbucks, but if you're here, might as well go check this place out. It's your typical, what you'd kind of expect a quaint French restaurant to be like. And if you go on the internet, it actually has really good reviews. So this is the TripAdvisor rating for this establishment. You can see over kind of on like the top left corner, it still has the Ravoux name attached to it, although the family does not own it anymore. That was from a long time ago. You got to remember, Vincent died 130 years ago, 131 actually. And so again, this is her in the film. So there's a little bit of a disconnect here. So in real life, when Vincent Van Gogh died, she was only 14 years old. And in the film, she plays a character that, in my opinion, is quite a bit older, maybe like, I don't know, 18 or 20 or 21. So she's much more mature in the film than she would have been in real life. And then also too, the postman's son comes up to Anvers to investigate Vincent's situation, and he ends up talking to her. So this whole part of the story didn't really happen. It's just, again, kind of a fictitious part of the story. So just wanted to point that out. And here's the two of them talking. So again, when you see this part, if you're a historical fanatic, you might get a little frustrated, but it is what it is. There's so many fascinating things in Vincent's life. I'm not quite sure why they took the historical liberties they did. I feel like, in my opinion, Vincent's life was fascinating enough. They could have just rolled with the stuff that actually took place, but for whatever reason, they decided to include or incorporate these fiction type sections, I guess you'd call them. And then Vincent actually ended up painting her 3 different times. So the image over on the left is the one that was the basis of her role in the film, but he also did the one in the center. and then the one on the right. And she actually really liked Vincent. One thing that's interesting about Vincent is you have kind of a mental image of, again, he's kind of this loner, and shy and awkward and, I don't know, maybe even weird or whatnot. But when you hear the accounts of people that knew him, like the postman, like the guy that had the paint supply store, like this family, they all have nothing but great things to say about him. So again, it's interesting studying Vincent, because oftentimes there's a little bit of a disconnect between our perception of what Vincent was like, and the reality. Now, I'm not saying that he was a saint and that everyone loved him. Don't want to say that, but suffice to say, there are quite a few people that knew him that actually had nothing but good things to say about him, and her family were one such group of people. This is the painting that he made of her. Oh, Judith said that she got to visit the restaurant. What did you think, Judith? Hopefully you liked it and had a good meal. Here's the second painting of her. And the third one. Now, he was only in this town for 10 weeks. So the fact that he made 3 paintings of her is pretty impressive, because he was only there for 10 weeks. And what happened when Vincent died was he went out to paint one day. You actually see a reproduction of this painting in the film, but Vincent went out to paint one day, and he comes back to the establishment late one evening, and he's got a gunshot wound in his chest. And so, again, this is known as the building where he died in. When you go upstairs, the building, now the top section is a museum. And so you go up the stairs, and that doorway on the left is where Vincent's room was. So again, this was a boarding house, this particular part of the building. The room that he was renting is on the right. It's a more recent photo. It's a really small room, nothing very fancy about it. And let's see, so let me go back. So here's what her account was, the young lady that's depicted in the film. This is her account of what she witnessed the day that Vincent died. And I'll read this to you. She says, quote, "Vincent walked bent, holding his stomach, again exaggerating his habit of holding one shoulder higher than the other. Mother asked him, and by the way, Vincent came home late that evening. He was usually there for supper, the family would serve, and he was very consistent in terms of like his schedule. So when he didn't show up for supper that evening, they started to get very concerned, because that was very unlike him. So then this young lady's mom says, 'Mr. Vincent, we were anxious. We are happy to see you to return. Have you had a problem?' And he replied in a suffering voice, 'No, but I have,' and he did not finish. 'Crossed the hall, took the staircase, and climbed to his bedroom. I was witness to this scene. Vincent made on us such a strange impression that father got up and went to the staircase to see if he could hear anything. And when her father was listening, he could hear Vincent upstairs moaning and groaning. And so he went upstairs to see if there was something wrong with him. And that's when he discovered that Vincent had the gunshot wound in his stomach.' And this is a picture, kind of a historical photo of what the room looked like. This was quite a few years after Vincent had died, but I'll give you a sense of what it looked like. Again, just a really small room. And when he's there on his deathbed, Vincent would live for 30 hours after he was shot. Dr. Cachet come to attend to him. And then also Vincent's brother Theo was summoned from Paris. And so he spent the last several hours of his life, Vincent did, with the doctor and his brother. But eventually he succumbs to the gunshot wound in this little room. So the room where Vincent Van Gogh died. Now, if you're interested in learning about another famous person who died of a gunshot wound in a boarding house, we, ironically enough, have a program on Abraham Lincoln and the assassination at Ford's Theater next month in mid-April. So 2 well-known, famous, important, great figures from history who died of gunshot wound in a boarding house. Mr. Lincoln died at the Peterson boarding house across the street from Ford's Theater. So you can be on the lookout for that in mid-April. And this is the burial spot of Vincent and his brother Theo. That's Vincent's gravesite on the left. This is a church cemetery that's not too far from the house where he died at. Interestingly enough, or tragically enough, his brother Theo, who had had a number of health issues himself, he ends up dying 6 months after Vincent did. And so the 2 brothers that were so close in life died so close to one another, just 6 months apart, and they're close to each other in death, buried side by side in the same cemetery. And Vincent's gravestone And you can go see that on your trip as well. So again, Vincent van Gogh, born March 30th, 1853, 168 years and 1 day ago, and died on July 29th, 1890 from the gunshot wound at the young age of 37. Now, one other thing to point out about the film is this film and the one yesterday have a little bit controversial conclusions because there's this big debate on whether or not Vincent died by suicide. The Vincent van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, which is the world's leading expert on all things Vincent van Gogh, their official theory is that Vincent did, in fact, die by suicide. However, there's a fair number of people that say, no, that's not true. He probably died by an accidental gunshot wound from these kids that were kind of pestering him. And that's the approach that the film yesterday, At Attorney's Gate, and the film tonight, Loving Vincent, takes. But that's really controversial. And people are really adamant about either one side of the spectrum or the other. If whoever you talk to that's familiar with this case, they usually have very strong opinions that yes, Vincent committed or died by suicide, or no, he died accidentally by these kids. And there's like, a happy medium, except maybe for me, I don't really have a opinion one way or the other. To me, and people ask me all the time when we do our tours at the National Gallery, like, what do you think, Robert? Do you think he killed himself, or did the kids kill him? I don't know. Both, to be honest with you, both scenarios seem highly plausible. When you hear the side of the story of why people think that he died by suicide, you take in all this information like, oh, there's some issues with that story, but overall it kind of makes sense. But then when you go hear the side of the story of the people who think he got killed accidentally by the kids and listen to their side of the story, you kind of think the same thing, like, boy, there's some things that maybe don't quite add up, but that does sound like it possibly could have happened like that. So to be honest with you, I really don't know if he died by suicide or not. To me, just the main thing is that tragically he died at a very young age of 37. So I tend not to dwell on that too much, but I know some people are very interested in knowing if he died for sure. So again, this is a third night of our program. We had Kirk Douglas, Lust for Life on Monday, At Attorney's Gate on Tuesday, and Loving Vincent on Wednesday. If you want to watch this historical context portion of any of these programs, either the one tonight or the previous two, they'll be on our YouTube page a little bit later this week. They're not out there now, but we're recording this and we'll save it out there so you can check that out. And we'll go ahead and stream the film. Now, if you're watching on Facebook, unfortunately, I have to disconnect you from the program because I can't stream this film on Facebook live because of copyright issues. I can play it on Zoom for those people watching on Zoom without any problem. But if you're watching on Facebook, unfortunately, I'm going to have to disconnect you. So thanks for joining us, Facebook friends, or those watching on YouTube, and I hope to see you at some point in time in the future. Let me hold on for 1 second. So if you're watching on Facebook and YouTube, we will see you again in a little bit. If you're watching on Zoom, sit tight and we'll watch the film